Polypede Works here, coming to you once again with One Piece chapter 1148 entitled Ranja. So we have the 33rd installment of the Yamato cover story, in which Yamato is going to deliver a Casa hat to Kawamatsu and Hakumai. And she is waving goodbye to Speed, Tama, and Raizo. And she is accompanied by Ulti and Page One, who have new outfits. It's weird seeing Ulti with a katana because she usually uses a Morning Star, so that's odd. And it appears that both of them are full-on Kozuki folks now, because Ulti is wearing a cloak with a sun on it, and as you may or may not know, there is a sun within the bird of the Kozuki crest. So yes, they are down with the Odin cause. Love to see it. I do wonder if Who's going to come back, because he did get unmasked last chapter in the 32nd installment. So that's something to look out for, because I do think he's going to join Yamato eventually, because there's nowhere for him to go. So I can see that happening in the future. And it's very important too that we do see what he looks like, seeing as how they made a point as to show us that he was unmasked. So there has to be something up with his face. Either it's a lore thing or it's a joke. Either way, I can't wait to see it. But with the chapter is named after Ranja, one of the giant children that we were introduced to last chapter. And the reason why she's such a sticking point in this chapter is because she's willing to sacrifice herself for the culture of her nation. Very patriotic. I love how since Momonosuke, we've been getting a lot of good child characters, and I love that they haven't been annoying. That's great. But Ranja's a very precious baby. She's willing to sacrifice herself so her friends and her family can enjoy the culture and the history that's been built up over the years, thanks to the Walrus School and the Owl Library. Because, of course, Summers and the rest of the Holy Knights want Jarl Mountainbeard to burn both of those down, because they want them to be without culture, without history, and they want them to just be thralls, mercenaries for their cause. Which, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, because over the years in One Piece, just as a whole, there's been a very odd point to get giants on your side, and this goes as far back as Enies Lobby, with the government enslaving Oimon and Kashi under the pretense that they had Bragi and Dory, but they didn't. And then two with Moria wanting ores, and et cetera, it goes on and on and on, right? So the motive makes a lot of sense. It's just really, really evil. And I love that Ranja has the selflessness to stick up for her country. It's really cool. So moving on, though, the point I want to talk about is Robin versus Summers. And there's a lot of interesting things to talk about here. So first off, Jinbei's still tied up. He's useless. Like, low key, I can't stand it. It drives me up a wall. I actually am upset. You can hear how upset I am, because I did a whole 12-minute rant on this when I covered chapter 1147. But I do find it funny that Summers is using a construct, a serpent in this case, made of thorn, as his mode of transportation, because he is of House Shepherd. Jupiter, the 5 Elder member, is also of House Shepherd, and he can actually turn into a serpentine creature in the form of a sandworm. The reason why I think we don't get a lot of Robin fights is because, due to how she fights and how she's fought for the entirety of the series, fights are usually over pretty quickly if she catches someone and just breaks them in two. They have no means of recovery. That's why the fights are very rare and far between, because the person to actually fight her has to catch her off guard, which is very hard to do, or constrain her in some way, which is why the Black Maria fight went how it went. Then when she got free, it was all over for Black Maria. With that being said, the interesting thing here is that Robin manages to strike Summers, pops him in the face with an attack I believe we've seen before. It looks familiar, but it kind of reminds me of a Gear second attack from how fast it comes out. It's very cool. And from the bit that we see in the panel when she's conjuring the hand to strike Summers, it's a hand made out of a bunch of hands. And I don't know if we've actually gotten clarification about this in the manga, but this is why I say all of her big constructs, including the big doe form, are not as confusing as people try to make them out to be, because we've seen this before a few times in the manga and in movies. Now, in the manga, it was a bit unclear because she had an attack against ores called Big Tree, and when she made a bunch of hands that turned into like a big oven mitt type hand to constrain ores. But the movie version is actually very clear as how these constructs work, because during the fourth movie, she was able to make a bunch of arms in order to change the trajectory of the Mary mid-flight, because of course the whole theme of movie 4 is this big race. So the point is that when she makes a big construct like she does in the fourth movie, which I believe is the first time that ever happens, she's making a whole bunch of smaller constructs into one big construct, which anytime we see that in the time skip or when she does the big double form, I think it's just that same principle. A bunch of constructs coming together to make one giant construct. Now, when we're talking about her versus Summers and then Summers versus Scalper Gabon, there are a few things I wanted to point out. Number one, I am glad that she knows about Summers' immortality. That makes sense because it was the Revolutionary Army who told us a little bit about the Holy Knights, and it was Ivankov who gave us the full name of Imu, Narona Imu. So the Revolutionary Army is in the know about all the upper echelon members of the world government. Seeing as how Robin spent 2 years with them, it makes sense that she would know some details about them. So I'm glad that all came up here. So I think with Summers and maybe Garling and Shamrock, those who don't have abilities that cater to evasion or regeneration rely on the Mark of the Abyss's blessing to give them regeneration. Because characters like Gunko and presumably Killingham do have the power to regenerate and or evade damage, because I think in the way that Gunko is presented, her abilities are much like, say, Katakuri's. Now, my explanation or understanding of Katakuri is that he is projecting a mochi body of himself, and then the real body is ducking and weaving within the mochi body to avoid damage, thanks to his power of observation haki. I think Gunko is doing the same thing with the arrow fruit. She is projecting a body of this arrow cloth, and then the real body is ducking and weaving away from conventional attack, and then that arrow body just fills back in where it was damaged, much like how Katakuri simply filled back in when he had his mochi body damaged. With that being said, Summers, much like, say, Doflamingo or Magellan, has an ability that is inherently offensive. Therefore, there isn't a real reason to evade or have any sort of defensive measures, because your ability allows you to hurt anyone you want without any real effort being put into it. As we see in his confrontation with Robin, he has an ability in which he can produce storms out of his body in an attempt to skewer Robin, which I love how she tricks him the whole way through his fight. I think it's very cool, and I love how Nami compliments her later. I think that's very cute. But I thought this would be the case when I did a video comparing him to Zala, otherwise known as Paula, otherwise known as Miss Doublefinger. And it's very funny that Robin is fighting someone who has similar abilities to her former co-worker. I think that's funny. This is very similar to Magellan, who has a coat of venom covering his body, which prevents him from being attacked by a person directly because he would just poison them if they got too close. But to bring things back to Summers, so I think the important thing to know when Summers is embarrassed by Gabon, when he gets his hand lobbed off, and when he is cut up the middle. I think the reason why he cannot regenerate is because Gabon is using some sort of projection of Conqueror's Haki that is shocking Sombras' system, preventing any additional Dull Fruit effects from going off, which then makes those attacks and damage permanent. So I think this is going to be very important for the future, because now in this late game part of One Piece, we are seeing that there are many a person with regenerative abilities, meaning those who are awakened, who are mythical Zoans, and those who are using some sort of evasive maneuver if they are a special paramecia, presumably. So with that being said, I think this brand of Conqueror's Haki stops all that from being a problem and brings everybody back to level. Now, the caveat of this is that this would also bring Gear 5th back to level, because much like when we first got the Haki explanation when the time skip was about to begin, it does put Luffy at risk, because back in the day, if you would recall, Luffy was running around with an inherent immunity, and that immunity was to blunt force. But once Haki started to be a problem in Sabaody Archipelago, we started to see that he no longer has that luxury. People can use Haki and affect him with blunt force. So much like the Logia users, he now too is at risk and has to use wits in order to overcome these new obstacles. I think the same thing is going to happen with this new brand of Conqueror's Haki, because the cartoon antics of Gear 5th might not be the solution in every situation if people can just go through all of that and hit him directly. Because I think in being a mythical Zoan, especially a mythical Zoan who is a divine entity, unlike the Five Elders, he probably has regeneration that is beyond their regeneration, because I think the regenerative properties that we see from most of the Five Elders are due in part to them being mythical awakened Zoans. And we'll see how far that goes depending on what happens to Killingham in this arc, because I think Killingham, based on him having a white Hagoromo, is very much like Luffy. So we'll perhaps see if he has any sort of unique regeneration. I do think he has regenerative properties thanks to the Mark of the Abyss, but I also think he has regenerative properties due to him just being an awakened mythical Zoan who also is a divine creature. But with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede What?